Okay. So now the meeting is being recorded. So we shall wait Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay to set his slides perfect, and then we'll start after that.
I think it's...
Yeah, I think it's better. Yes.
It's much better. Yeah.
Yes. So we can start now. Okay. So good evening, everyone, and namaskar to all. So this is Amarendra Das, the Secretary of Orissa Economics Association. And before we get into the discussion today, let me give you some information about the Orissa Economics Association. Professor Loraine was very much interested to know about Orissa Economics Association. And there might be also other members who would be joining for the first time this meeting. So Orissa Economics Association was basically formed in the year 1968. And it is one of the oldest regional associations of India. And so every year we organize annual conferences. And this year we'll be organizing, basically in 2023, we'll be organizing the 55th annual conference of Orissa Economics Association at Kalahandi University, Bhawanipatna. And now we have about 750 live members. And some of the past presidents of Orissa Economics Association include Professor Prashant Patnaik, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Manoj Panda is here with us, Professor Santosh Panda, Professor Pulin Behar Nayak, and this year's president is Professor Keshab Das, who is currently the senior professor at Gujarat Institute of Development Research, Ahmedabad. And the Orissa Economic Association is also publishing, it has been publishing this journal. There is a journal called Orissa Economic Journal. Earlier, it used to be known as Orissa Economic Journal, but this year we have changed the name and it is now Orissa Economic Journal. And this is listed in the UGC CARE. And of course, this is recently only listed. And Professor Keshab Das is the executive editor of the journal. And we have been also trying very hard actually to improve the quality of the journal substantially. And we are trying to get it listed in the Scopus. Hopefully, we'll be doing it in a year or so. That is briefly about actually the Orissa Economic Association. It's not that only we organize conferences. We do organize some memorial lectures. We have 3 memorial lectures we organize. And then we do capacity building programs for college teachers and PhD scholars, like how to write proposal, how to do review of literature, and such capacity building programs we organize in between. And in fact, hopefully in November, we will be organizing a workshop for our college lecturers in Odisha, how to basically improve the quality of research, basically undergraduate research program, because the undergraduate students in Odisha prepare a dissertation, and how to improve the quality of that dissertation. For that, we will be holding another workshop sometime in November. So I think with this about Orissa Economic Association, let me welcome all of you. And first of all, let me welcome Professor Loraine Kennedy, who is the CNRS Research Director and member Center for South Asian Studies. And then let me also welcome Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, who is a senior fellow at Center for Policy Research, New Delhi. And this session will be moderated by Dr. Ashima Sood, who is an associate professor at Anant National University, Ahmedabad. And this session will be chaired by Professor Keshab Das, the president of Orissa Economics Association. And so first of all, I would like to thank all of you for agreeing to share your knowledge and time with us. And so with this, I now hand over the floor to Professor Keshab Das to start the session. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so very much, Amarendra. It's a great occasion. It feels extremely happy that sort of we are amongst people, particularly the speakers, who are very, very distinguished. And one small sort of link, if I may find, apart from there a lot of work on urbanization. I mean, that's that apart. I think all the three have very, very interesting common work and interest in policy making, contributing to policy, and not just sort of based on sort of secondary data, which is sort of like usually used by many of the scholars. I think many of all the three have a very close interaction with the micro reality. They are the ones who have been unraveling what is happening in the micro urban space and relating it to larger issues. And in that process, I think their contribution to policy is tremendous. And there are also people sort of who are very often consulted for varieties of issues. And so we are so very happy to have all the three with us. They have been sort of constantly writing, and they have been very, very active both in the academic and in the non-academic sort of fora. So with that, we welcome all the three of them. And I'm not the person to talk about urbanization, but then whatever little we sort of know in the recent decades, for instance, because the last census we had was in 2011, so that also so creates a certain kind of disadvantage for us to make any great sort of comments on what happened to urbanization, which was sort of at least 2011 data tells us that it was at 31.16%. But then we also know from the UN World Urbanization Prospects that it could be, that was in 2018, it could be 34%. And what is most interesting to learn from whatever literature is that I think the center or the fulcrum of urban growth actually has been very steadily and very significantly moving towards Asia, and maybe sort of moving away from Africa and Latin American countries. So, and within that, India is actually a major contributor. So, and then with its huge population, poverty, and varieties of politics at play at several spaces, I think the nuances are to be sort of observed and commented upon. So for that, we have three, as I said, very, very interesting speakers. Let me start with Professor Loraine Kennedy, who is the CNRS Research Director and member of the Center for South Asian Studies, CEIAS in Paris with the EHESS. So she has been sort of working, I know her PhD was on the sort of political economy of decentralized governance in Kerala. She has been working on India for a long, long time, and sort of very interesting interface between political economy, political geography, and her very interesting work on a kind of a book which she has published, Rescaling Space, which is a very, very in fact, I have sort of followed that book in one of my papers to explain Gujarat's industrialization. And she and Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, so together they have edited another very significant book on the SEZs that's called Power, Policy and Protest, published by the Oxford University Press. And Professor Kennedy has been sort of working on India's greenfield urban future, that is with Dr. Ashima Sood. So they are very, very active scholars. And Professor Loraine Kennedy also is a trustee of the Glasgow-based Urban Studies Foundation, and she is the president of the Scientific Council, overseeing the network of French research institutes in Asia. She is also engaged in editing Samaj, which is a South Asian multidisciplinary academic journal. And she has been coming to India. She has worked in India with several scholars for a long time. So welcome, Professor Loraine Kennedy. Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, again, as I did mention, that she is a very distinguished scholar for us. She is a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. And for a long time, he was associated with the Infrastructure Development Finance Company, IDFC, which in fact, as I also sort of the first time I met him, he was very deeply involved in bringing out what are known as the India Infrastructure Report, and he had been a major contributor. He was one of the persons who ideated that, and he had a long-standing work with Exim Bank, the World Bank, and he had been with the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, in XLRI in Jamshedpur. He has taught at School of Planning and Architecture, and he was the chair of the group on migration of the Government of India, and he has previously been associated with the Committee on Allocation of Natural Resources with the Prime Minister's Task Force on Infrastructure. He also served as Scientific Advisory Council on LIRN East Asia, LIRN Asia in Colombo. He has a PhD in economics from the New York University, also a student of Delhi School of Economics, a very, very distinguished career, and his research also spans not just in India, but several countries, and of late also relating to China. With that, I sort of quickly move to Dr. Ashima Sood, currently Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Center for Urbanism and Cultural Economics at Anant National University in Ahmedabad. And her work has been on on sustainable cities and communities, which is the SDG goal 11. She has been sort of working both on sort of using quantitative and qualitative information on sort of challenges of urban informality. She is a doctorate from the Cornell University in the US, and she has sort of published in urban studies in cities, territory, politics, governance, Journal of Institutional Economics, and of course in EPW, with which she is very closely associated. She's, if I may just add one more thing, which is not exactly on urban economics or urban studies. She is a prize-winning fiction writer, and her work, both sort of poems and essays and stories, have been published in several international journals. So we are so very happy, proud, privileged to be with you three. And this is, as you might note, that this is a colloquial, this is more of an interactive sort of event. And so I sort of, with this, I leave it to Dr. Ashima Sood, and she will be conducting it for the rest of the event. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keshab Das and Dr. Amarendra Das, for organizing this event and inviting all of us. Good afternoon to all our audience, wherever you may be. I think I'm, really honored today to be part of this very timely conversation with two experts on the political economy and public policy around urban peripheries in India. And Dr. Loraine Kennedy, who will be speaking first, is the leading scholar, I would say, on center state and local rescaling processes in India and on themes of peripheral urbanization. Not only did she co-edit the 2021 special issue of the South Asia Multidisciplinary Academic Journal, Samaj, called Engaging the Urban from the Periphery. She is the author of multiple pioneering papers on peri-urban Hyderabad and land dynamics in Hyderabad, also in Haryana. And she is most recently the co-author of a really fascinating paper with Alexander Follman, Karen Pfeffer, and Fulong Wu. And the paper is titled Peri-urban Transformation in the Global South, a comparative socio-spatial analytics approach. The paper combines geospatial data and qualitative fieldwork in really innovative ways, I think, to examine how processes of market-led property development, state-led mega projects, and fragmented planning practice produce variegated peri-urban landscapes in settings that are really varied, from Delhi's National Capital Region to Accra in Ghana and Shanghai, in China. So with that, let me hand it over to Dr. Kennedy, and really look forward to your remarks.
Thank you very much, Ashima, Dr. Sood. I'm very honored to be here, and I'd like to also thank Dr. Amarendra Das and, of course, Professor Keshab Das, who's a very old and dear colleague and friend. It's an honor for me to appear, I guess not on the stage, but on the screen with Partha Mukhopadhyay and Ashima Sood. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I know that we share a lot of common interests. Thank you very much, Dr. Ashima Sood, for that opening into this recent paper, because that's precisely what I plan to discuss today. So I will share my screen. Just tell me quickly, how much time are we thinking? Because I should stick to the limits.
Maybe about 25 minutes, 20 to
Okay,
25 minutes.
I won't go over that for sure. Okay, so here we go. I hope this will come through. Let me switch to presentation mode. Okay. So I assume you can all see that.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thanks. So yes, I thought, when Keshab mentioned that what the theme would be for today's discussion, I started thinking about, okay, so, where do you start with this idea of peripheral urbanization? I mean, it is a topic that I've been interested in for the last few years. And in fact, Keshab, you're absolutely right that for me, my own work, which was very much on, very policy centered and remains quite policy centered, really shifted to the urban. I mean, following what was happening on the ground in India, starting in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I was interested in economic development policies. And, as state governments started, kind of moving away from this kind of a more centralized management of the economy and started sort of defining their own economic development policies, one could observe that these policies were very much, or very often, centered on large cities, and this was the case at the time. I was looking at the case of Andhra Pradesh, undivided Andhra Pradesh, and Hyderabad. So that was a very compelling case, and that really, ended up being a shift in my research interest to more toward urban issues. So yes, I decided to for this talk to just develop a little bit this paper that we recently published. So I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Alexander Fulman, who's at the University of Cologne, Karen Pfeffer, the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and Fulong Wu, who's at the Bartlett School, University College London. So, I guess some of the basic kind of questions that are, the backdrop for this kind of research is, how do we understand what's happening in the urban agglomerations, whatever shape they might take, and why are we focusing on the peripheries? And so this is what we'll be talking a bit about today. I think it all comes down to sort of trying to understand, what are the drivers of these urban transformations and how do they translate in space? And, as I started becoming interested in, how economic development policies were driving sort of urban development, it was very clear that most of these transformations were happening on the peripheries. I mean, less in the core city and more on the peripheries. And there's a lot of, good reasons for that, a lot of kind of economic rationales that would explain that. And then another thing I'd like to touch on a bit, and maybe we can come back to this in the discussion, is also how can we think about this, what's happening on the urban peripheries in India, in a comparative perspective, and why might we want to do that? And so the backdrop for this, even though I think there won't really be time to develop this very much, is this idea that, where is urbanization happening? Well, it's mainly happening in Asia and Africa. And so it makes sense that if you're interested in urban theory and understanding how urbanization processes happen in the 21st century, you need to really try to understand what's happening where, you know, the dynamic is the strongest. And there's just no comparison. It's not Europe, it's not North America, certainly. So that's part of this, you know, I think awareness now that that there's new theory that needs to be grounded in places where urbanization is happening. And India's urbanization is projected to increase significantly in the next decades. And so I guess that's, in a way, it's kind of a pitch for more work on urban research. And I think economists in particular have a role to play, even though maybe this has not traditionally been a topic that's been, you know, I think, of course, Partha Mukhopadhyay and Ashima Sood are very prominent exceptions to that. But I think they would agree that there still remains, you know, a lot to be done on the economic dimensions of this urban transformation. So just kind of, you know, backdrop, why focus on urban peripheries? Well, this is where the changes are most rapid, whether it's land use change. This is also where large scale investments are taking place, private and public investments. One can think of, Keshab Das mentioned the work we've done on SEZs, on special economic zones. You know, many of these were on the peripheries of metropolitan cities. Many state governments have built industrial estates on their, you know, outside their large cities. Transport infrastructure, you know, ring roads, urban peripheries are something we're seeing, a lot of transport infrastructure also. And of course, housing. I think this photo illustrates that well. I think many of us are very familiar with these large scale, high rise, middle class housing that's coming up in the urban peripheries. You've also got, you know, maybe less high rise, but still much housing that's being built by the private sector. And of course, land markets. There's a lot of speculation going on. Land prices are going up very quickly. And I think when you look at the sort of international literature on peri-urban development, you certainly can observe a number of common features across many countries. One of my colleagues calls this a hybrid spatio-temporal configurations. This is Alex Follman's work, and also our colleagues Singh and Loraine. So what are we talking about? We're talking about, of course, population growth. It's especially if migrants are coming from villages or rural areas, they're going to look for housing that is affordable. And this might be only on the in informal settlements on the urban peripheries. But as I mentioned, there's also this kind of middle class housing. So you've got, you know, middle class also moving maybe out of the core city to the peripheries. You've got all kinds of demographic growth, shifting economic activities. This is linked to the changes in land use, and all kinds of processes of land transactions and land conversion. And all different kinds of actors, I should add. You know, one, I think, you know, it's usual to sort of think of, you know, DLFs and, you know, these large scale developers, but you've also got all kinds of incremental sort of processes taking place, you know, small landowners who are also seeking to maybe build up a small housing complex, maybe just 2 to 3 stories, and thereby sort of, take advantage of these opportunities and this demand for housing. There's also been a fair amount of research, pointing out how difficult it is to really grasp what's going on in terms of the governance, the actors, the different actors in place, and how they're interacting. In part because these areas very often come under rural administration, and they're not part of the municipality. Sometimes they're not even within, the planning area. And so there's all kinds of ambiguity in terms of regulations, and this has been called legal pluralism. So what we tried to do in this paper is we tried to, and it actually comes out of a working group which we formed about 5 years ago, and so much of this work again has been kind of inductive. It's been through a lot of discussions and meetings, but I think what we all wanted to do was to try and actually apply a common kind of an approach in different places. So in this particular paper, as Ashima mentioned, we have a case from Ghana and a case from China and a case from India. And part of this was to try to go beyond, I think we're all aware of the fact that, disciplines very often don't read each other. We knew there was a lot of good work going on in kind of what are called the geosciences, or the geospatial sciences. If you pick up a remote sensing journal, which many of us might not do very often, it's very surprising to see that there are articles on, Chennai, Hyderabad, Bombay, Shanghai, all kinds of cities that we might otherwise be following literature on in the social sciences. And so it's really quite fascinating. And one of the things we wanted to do in this project, and that resulted in this paper, was to try and combine in a systematic way tools from the geospatial sciences and more tools that methods we're more familiar with from the social sciences, and to try to capture and compare the sort of relationships between the morphology, the physical expansion of cities, and characterizing that expansion, and the dynamics of socioeconomic change. And we know that there's economic restructuring happening, and that this is having an impact on employment and all kinds of income effects. I mean, in terms of like the residential and commercial developments that we can observe in the peripheries. And how can we sort of try to study together the morphology, the shape that this is having, the physical shape, with these other changes in both the economy and the governance of these spaces. And so we came up with these because it's one thing to sort of try to bring together tools from these different disciplinary areas, but it's another to sort of try to get them to speak to each other. And so we came up with these 2 pairs of what we call conceptual lenses: fragmentation, integration, connectivity, and bypass. And these particular concepts, they have a meaning, and they have a kind of a history in different disciplines. You can talk about, from the geospatial sciences, you can talk about fragmentation and integration, and these are metrics that you can measure from, like, say, a satellite image. They have ways of sort of applying these tools to characterize a degree of integration, a degree of fragmentation. And likewise, connectivity and bypass have, physical manifestations. And at the same time, in social sciences, we're used to talking about fragmentation, fragmented, governance, or a more like, inclusive or exclusive. Connectivity and bypass, we're also used to talking about this in a figurative way in the social sciences. So we use these in our cases. And the decision, to do this comparatively was very much, influenced by literature and a kind of a comparative turn in social sciences, which, moved away from the idea of comparing cities to comparing, processes that are occurring within cities, or comparing particular types of relationships that are occurring, between different types of factors. So these are quite fascinating debates, and so we were convinced, I think, that we could each learn more about our individual cases by looking at them comparatively with others, or at least that was the sort of challenge of this exercise. And so, it wasn't at all this idea that, we assumed that peripheral urbanization in Africa and Asia and elsewhere is following, identical sort of patterns. And in fact, very, very quickly on, we were able to observe that that morphologies, varied quite a lot among our different cases. And yet we could also clearly see that there were, common features among them. One of which, of course, is, again, using our lenses, these fragmented patterns of expansion, with variations, of course. And I think, it's not too difficult to sort of understand, some of the reasons why that might be. So I realize that these are not large enough to really see and appreciate, but my point on displaying them is just to, and I think when you're not from the geospatial sciences, it's just fascinating to see, what they're able to do. So of course these are my colleagues who are specialists of remote sensing and other sort of spatial tools, and so what we tried to do across our three cases was first to use these tools to sort of measure the expansion and the change in land use and land cover patterns across this. This was kind of like a first step. And we did this at varying scales. To your left here, we have these two communities that were studied in the case of Accra in Ghana, and changes over time. In Faridabad on the right, the colleagues from Cologne used what they call the transect method to understand how, over time, this changes happened along particular routes. And this was actually collaborative work that was done with students and faculty at JNU. So again, we tried to combine, methods that classify, measure, and characterize these dynamics from a spatial viewpoint, and then to, sort of deconstruct and explain using, both theory and methods from social sciences. And in the case of Faridabad, just to give an example, these were the different images that were used, and then also, of course, the qualitative methods through interviews and observations on the ground, and some surveys. And just to sort of, move to what we found across these cases is that in all of them, the three main drivers of change were in part linked to property development. This is very powerful and one of the main drivers of change. But state policy and strategies are also equally important, because they are partly what induce market forces in response to, say, an expressway, or right now I'm based out of Chennai, and I'm actually carrying forward this research in the Chennai case, and the kind of automobile corridor and the IT corridor are examples of large-scale, state-led investments that are very influential in driving the sort of private investments that follow in property and determine the type of investments that are taking place. And thirdly, are more, I guess you'd say, historically grounded kinds of processes of planning and development practices that are linked to specific histories and are linked to political economies, which of course have an impact on distributional aspects. And what we found is that it's not these processes that can be taken just individually, but it's more how they interact with each other in specific places that really determine the outcomes that we are finding. So if we take them individually, with regard to the property development, across the cases, we found that at least for the private property, the private investments, that there was very much a trend in favor of upper and middle class residential spaces. And I mean, this is actually quite intuitive if you observe in the peripheries of large cities. This is quite evident, and likewise this problem, the shortage of more affordable housing and low-income housing. And now this was, of course, a little bit less the case in Shanghai, where local governments, are this is part of their mandate to provide housing. In the case of Faridabad, which I think all of you may be more interested in, it was clear that there was a kind of a shared agenda on the part of public and private actors to develop property, and also on the part of the state government to spend quite a lot of investment on transport to Delhi. And so that remains it was, Faridabad, of course, was sort of initially developed as a satellite city, and this remains the linear kind of infrastructure to Delhi. It remains extremely important, even though there is a kind of diversification happening. So a common feature, of course, is that planned development tends to cater to upper segments of the market, whereas lower income households rely more on auto-constructed or smaller, much smaller developments. And in all cases, land politics is a very big part of this story, because developers need access to land, and how these markets are functioning varies from place to place, as would be expected. I think I've already talked a little bit about the state-led development strategies. I think that's pretty straightforward. These strategies do tend to sort of induce more incremental kind of actions from individual property owners. And then lastly, this strong correlation that we found between institutional fragmentation and spatial fragmentation. The Chinese case was the one where, I think there was the most planned development, and so there was, perhaps less fragmentation than the two other cases, but still, there were cases of rural villages that were sort of bypassed in this development. Another common feature was that we were able to observe a kind of dismantling of collectively held user rights, so a movement toward more individual property rights. But we did find that it's not just the state actors and the market actors, but that social movements or social mobilization could, in some cases, mitigate some of the processes of fragmentation and bypass that we found, and we can come back to that point if you like. But so just to wrap up the key points again, one might observe similar sort of rates of urbanization, and there might be in common this focus on the peripheries, but that actually the morphologies, the sort of in-depth spatial analysis shows that these are all very different in different places. However, these three common processes were drivers across all the cases, but their interlinkages varied on the ground as a function of the sort of history of the specific, histories of each place. Key factors also were linked to, political capabilities of these urban bodies or the agencies in charge of urban development, and also, of course, commitment to planning norms. And I think it's fitting to sort of wrap up on the idea that of course, these broader political economic context is part of this analysis, as this will, necessarily shape the distributional aspects that one can see across these cases. So I will stop there, stop sharing my screen, and I'd be very happy to, take questions or comments later on in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. I think that the paper is such a fabulous, I think very, very illuminating instance, model, exemplar of comparative urbanism. And it is wonderful to see, these three very diverse cases, juxtaposed with each other. And I think the insights that we get from that juxtaposition, in fact, really help drive our understanding forward in so many ways. So thank you. I think we will have, including myself, will have questions about your very, I think, illuminating presentation. I want to now invite Dr. Partha Mukhopadhyay and just say a few words about him, because he's probably one of the first names that comes to mind when we think about the field of urban economics in India. And of course, Dr. Mukhopadhyay has in fact been writing extensively about India's urban frontier and emerging models of urbanization for quite a while. All of you may be familiar with his very important contribution on subaltern urbanization, which is, these new forms of small and medium towns that are not necessarily tied up with metropolitan growth. And this is work that he did with Dr. Marie-Helene Zara and Dr. Eric Denis. And he's also written a lot about this explosion of census towns that we saw in the 2011 census, the impact of that, as well as the politics of statutory classification across the rural and the urban categories. So with that, over to you, Dr. Mukhopadhyay.
Thank you so much, Ashima. Am I audible? Yes, thank you. And I'll briefly see if I can share a screen. I have like a 2-slide presentation, so much less, let me see if this works. If it doesn't work well, we'll try and think of something else. Is this a full screen that you can see?
We can see it. It's not on presentation mode, though, Partha.
It's not in presentation mode. That's interesting because it's on presentation mode in my screen. So I'm trying to figure out what we can do with that and then take it from there. If, otherwise, I'll just sort of try and see if, let me see if I can try and present something else and say your entire screen and see whether that works.
Yeah, please share the entire screen. Yes, that will be.
And then that may or may not function. So let me just check once more. I'm realizing that I'm getting, let me see if that works. Okay, this shouldn't actually work. Okay. And now let me go back to, do you see the whole screen now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And it says what is the urban periphery, I hope.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. So I am.
We're on the same page.
Yes. That's amazing. So first of all, Ashima is obviously way too generous. I'm just around a lot of very hardworking and smart people at the Center for Policy Research, and I sort of benefit from that space. And of course, working with people like Loraine and Ashima can never be bad for your intellectual growth. So those are debts that I have to acknowledge. And then I also see that my colleague Kanu Pradhan is in the audience, and he will recognize that there are two references at the bottom of the screen, and that's work by him and the other colleague Shumendra Roy, who have been working on the census towns that Ashima mentioned. Kanu's, I think, was the first major piece that came out now about maybe 8 years ago, and so. And I'll come to that in a second. So I'm going to swivel a little bit from Loraine's very rich and detailed comparative focus to a slightly more conceptual level to ask and largely provocative in the lines of the colloquium so that we can have a rich discussion, and hopefully I'll keep this shorter, and to ask three questions. As to how we think of the urban periphery, right? And in this presentation, I'll argue that it's constructive to think of the urban periphery in three ways. The first is what I call the periphery of citizenship, where essentially these are people and places which are very much within the city as we recognize it in terms of an administrative boundary, but not of it. They're in the city, but not of it. They do not enjoy the same quote-unquote citizenship rights that other people in the city enjoy. And this is work that's essentially sort of work with Patrick Heller and with people like Shahana Sheikh and Subhadra Banda and others who have been part of the Cities of Delhi project, which is in CPR, and that includes other colleagues like Isha and Sonal and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, it focuses on this, and it also is inspired in some sense because a lot of this work is linked to our work with the IRD on their INDERBS project. So Veronique and Marie-Hélène, Veronique Dupont and Marie-Hélène Zera that Ashima mentioned are also very much central to these kinds of conceptualizations. So the issue here is where we're thinking about essentially informal settlements, and you think about informal settlements as if they are the periphery of citizenship, even though they're right in front of you, but they don't enjoy the same levels of services that you have, right? And therefore, they're unable to fully contribute to and benefit from being in the location where they are. they're obviously better off perhaps than where they could have been otherwise. And that's the migration story. But the question is whether the city is making the fullest use of their capabilities. And there comes in the issue of the impact of interventions in the space, and the policy issue that Keshab spoke about right at the beginning is when you intervene in these spaces, what is the kind of intervention you want to do, and what kind of impact it has on the economic vitality of the city. So one of the most sort of, I think, vanguard interventions that's been taking place is in Orissa as part of Orissa's Jaga mission, which flows from Orissa's land rights law, which came through, I think, in 2015, which essentially conferred a certain degree of ownership. And I say a degree of ownership in the sense that this is not fully alienable title that you think of when you think of land titles, but enough of a title for people to A, feel secure, and B, in very sort of important way, able to leverage the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, the Housing for All scheme of the central government, to improve their housing. Right? So that's the way in which, and I'm happy to sort of engage with that, and there may be differing perceptions of people who are already based there, and it'd be a wonderful conversation to have in that space. But the proposition I'm advancing in this case is that what this kind of intervention will do is not only improve the lives of the people who are in there, but it essentially lays the foundation for the economic vitality of the city in the following sense, that it enables the city to become a much more attractive place for people to migrate to, knowing that they have a place to stay. Not in the sense of, oh, let me go there and squat and I'll get legalized, but because these kinds of spaces that have been legalized then provide a rich supply of relatively low-cost, well-located rental housing, absence of which is one of the reasons why you have the kinds of informal settlements today in many places. And this, therefore, then enables this workforce to be much more productive in whatever economic activity the city is doing. And so you essentially have a city that is ready to grow, and obviously not all cities will be doing that. Even now, I understand this program was limited to all but the top 5 cities of Orissa, and they're just now starting on the big cities of Orissa. But as we will find out down the line, it makes a lot of sense also to focus on secondary cities. So the first issue is on the periphery of citizenship, and how do we address it? Is Orissa one model of moving forward? What are the benefits and costs of doing that? And my proposition in that space is the kind of approach that Orissa is adopting is net positive in terms of the benefit. That's the first proposition I'll lay for you this evening. The second is the periphery of the city. And this is very much, I think, the focus of Loraine's presentation. And I think it's a very important piece of that story, because if we look at the kind of economic activity and transformation that I have been saying, and census towns again that were mentioned, work that Kanu and Shamindra have done essentially indicate that proximate census towns, which is census towns that are near the boundary of a large city, whether they are actually adjacent in terms of sharing a boundary, which are called peripheral, and interstitial, which share boundaries with 2 sort of statutory towns, or non-peripheral, means they are not absolutely adjacent, but close enough. That group of census towns accounts for about 60% of the population of census towns, new census towns that came up in between 2001 and 2000. And so consequently, what you have is this is therefore a relatively vibrant economic space. And also, as you can see from the variety of structures, if you look at Loraine mentioned different geospatial analysis of the work that we have been doing somewhat on night lights and the expansion of night lights and structures. I'd be happy to sort of expand on that down the line if people are interested, is very much indicative of the fact that you do have a periphery of the city. However, in detailed work that we have done in Bangalore and Hyderabad, which I'm not showing here, but happy to do so, you essentially find that that shelf is pretty steep in the sense that it drops off pretty steeply, so that within about 20 kilometers of the city, you more or less lose much of the impact of the city itself, right, in terms of development structures. But within these census towns, the Roy and Pradhan show that there is a lot of difference in terms of the economic indicators, especially, for example, one of the indicators they use is the share of households with two-wheelers. And you see that there is really a significant difference in these kinds of, in the sort of economic well-being mentioned, sort of measured in these kinds of census towns vis-a-vis, and remember, these are all rural areas, they're still very much rural areas, in these kinds of census towns and structures going forward as compared to other villages, and makes them comparable to small towns. The other insight that they find is that a lot of the peripheral activity is also taking place in towns of between 100 to 500,000, which is the intermediate scale towns. And therefore, as I said, it's important to think about activity beyond the large metropolitan cities, which was the provocation for our first study of subaltern urbanization, which we sort of then grew into a variety of spaces. And I'm glad to see that being taken up in very contexts down the line. But it's definitely one of the spaces that we hope will get some traction going forward. What's the policy story on this? The policy story on this, therefore, becomes being at the periphery of the city, then definitions of boundaries, administrative definitions of boundaries, whether they're to be incorporated or not incorporated, matter. So depending on whether, so one of the questions that the policy question here is, do we incorporate these places within the city? Do we incorporate closer other cities next to it? Do we just expand the boundaries of the cities? And of course, in many places, as we are seeing, Andhra being a very interesting example in the case of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana that I was just talking about, if the development authority is sufficiently widely defined, you might end up in, and they have, given the way the government of India works, they've been allowed to include census towns within development authority boundaries as part of the urban housing scheme, and they have gone ahead and done so, right? So there are, I'm happy to talk about these kinds of policy innovations that states are doing, but the question is, if you just bring it within the development authority boundary story, what you do is you valorize land and make it possible for the development authority to then, because the development authorities in India are not really concerned about development. What they're concerned about is largely, what you say, is land value capture and trying to increase structures in that space. So if you are looking at provision of services and the differential citizenship that might also extend to the periphery of the city, then it might make more sense to bring them within the administrative framework of the city itself, the urban local body, rather than that of the development authority. Okay, so that's the second proposition I have for you on the periphery of the city. And finally, the story about the periphery of urbanization itself. And this is, where is the urban frontier and how is it expanding? And one of the things that we find out is while 60% of the census town populations are quote unquote, as you said, proximate, 40% is not, right? And the interesting feature of that remaining 40% is the fact that roughly, in some sense, in a 70-30 ratio, what you have is they're clustered, which means there are 2 or 3 census towns close to each other, or they are 30% is isolated, means a single census town, a single settlement going forward. And this is in some sense testimony to the transformation that is taking place much more widely in rural India, which I will come to in a second, and the concentration of certain kinds of activities. Most of them are market-led activities, but they also service-led in terms of repairs of things like cell phones, in terms of transport and varieties of other structures. There's some very interesting, Keshab mentioned sort of micro-level work. So work with Gopa Samanta, Marie Helen, and others, Augustine Maria, who one did in rural Bihar, in Madhubani, and in Jharkhand, and also in Orissa, around in some of these places, especially, which sort of point to the kinds of activities that have been cropping up in these kinds of areas, right? So the central thing here is how sustainable are these activities. Another colleague early on, Pranav Sidhwani, sort of had shown that villages tend to move back and forth. Sort of suddenly in one census you see a lot of non-farm activity, in the next census you see that village dropping below thresholds. And it is testimony to the other kind of work that Surinder Jyotka speaks about, which is multiple forms of work that households now sort of undertake and sort of move between them. You see that in the migration work, where short-term migrants sort of move between farm and non-farm work. So what you have is a situation where is this kind of thing stable and sustainable? And my own sense is perhaps if you're isolated, it is less, you're more at risk and vulnerable. But if you're clustered, it's quite possible that you have developed a certain stable agglomeration in these places for you to be paid attention. The core issue here is what is the state? This is essentially outside the purview of the state. This is happening in the shadows. This is happening under rural sort of aegis. And to the extent that we now are having things like Jal Jeevan Mission, which says 24/7 water in rural areas, you now have sanitation missions, which sort of provide you with full sanitation. It's a question of where exactly is the line blurring and what is the benefits of moving it into the urban space. And this is another point of discussion that one could have. What I did find in my work, one of the pieces of my work is that given the kind of apathy that smaller urban towns face, smaller ULBs, urban local bodies face from the government, the actual, it is statistically difficult to distinguish between the quality of life in a census town and the quality of life in a smaller urban local body. And therefore, the benefits of actually making them urban is something that one needs to think about rather than sort of automatically assume, right? And finally, to close, I come to this whole issue of rural transformation. There is all this urbanization, but there's a lot of, all our urban, India, as all of you know, has a very strict definition of the urban. It is the only country in the world which uses a three-pronged definition, which uses both the non-farm work, density, and size across the board, and very high levels of non-farm. So 75% is a very high threshold. And so it's very difficult to be urban in India. So it's useful to look at what is happening in what is defined by India as a rural. And there, has the slide moved to two figures at the moment?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. So what I have done here is something very simple. One just takes the national accounts, and one takes the number of workers in these kinds of spaces to look at the ratio of urban to rural value added per worker. And we are, I think there's a mistake, which is the index of value added for worker is the bottom. The top is actually, sorry. We're looking at the share of the urban to rural value added in and the top, and the index of value added per worker that we're looking at compared to the rural agriculture being equal to 1, right? And what you find here is that in even places like real estate for sort of weird reasons and manufacturing, actually the smaller rural workforce, but they seem to be doing a lot of production, right? So the actual value add benefit, the productivity benefit of urbanization is actually relatively small. This is sort of work that was recently sort of came out in something called Urban Affairs Review, a small little piece of one put together to link to Professor Mathur's excellent work that has come out recently. And if you look at the index of value added per worker in rural and urban, you find that the differences outside of things like finance, etc., is not as much as you would expect. And as you said, as you found out in things like manufacturing and in things like real estate and stuff like that, there is really not as much benefit as you would expect. So the fundamental, the bottom graph, what I would like your attention to is because people are going to be moving out of rural into different activities. And when they move out of rural to different activities, what kind of value addition do they actually get? So if you sort of move from, let's say, from agriculture to urban agriculture, you get like a 20% boost, but if you move to agriculture to urban public administration, obviously you get like a 10 times X boost, right? But if you move to manufacturing, you only get a 3X. So, and what you are finding here is that even if you move activities without moving location, that if you move from rural agriculture to rural manufacturing, you still get a substantial boost. If you move from rural agriculture to rural trade and hotels or to rural construction, you still get substantial boosts. So and this is happening in terms of so roughly about a third of our rural income is now sort of non-agricultural, and only about the share of urban GDP is stuck at around 55%, right? Or even less in some sense. So consequently, what we are beginning to see is an economic transformation that is sort of delinked from the administrative classification. And therefore, the call here is for a much more careful understanding of where exactly this transition is taking place, and the use of night lights and built-up areas, etc., help us understand some of that. Because that is what will help us sort of get a sense of exactly how the transition is occurring, because the standard categorization of urban and rural may hide actually more than it actually sees. Let me finish then by, I just dug this out from some old work that Shamindra and I had done, and since this was Orissa, I thought I'd present it and sort of link to sort of the state issue that Loraine brought out in peripheral stuff. So the two bars that you see here are essentially sub-districts which have industrial areas and sub-districts which don't have industrial areas. The left-hand side is bars which have industrial areas, and the right-hand side are bars which don't have industrial areas. And if you look at the two bottom panels, the left-hand bottom panel shows you the percentage of non-farm work, and the right-hand bottom panel shows you the percentage of households with two-wheelers. And you find that where you do have industrial areas in those sub-districts, you do find households having, at least in Orissa, a substantial difference in these kinds of outcomes. And therefore, there is some, and this provides some evidence that state-led sort of interventions do actually have some outcomes going forward. With that, I'll conclude and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Partha and Dr. Mukhopadhyay. I thought, as usual, very insightful, not just in terms of the observations that you make. I think very important to keep in mind, for example, development authorities in India, not necessarily thinking about development, they're thinking about land value capture. But I think the categories, the way that the framework, I think gives us a way to embed a lot of recent conceptualizations that have come up. And we think about the periphery of citizenship, the periphery of the city, potentially the periphery of urbanization. I think it allows us to perhaps pull together many of the strands in the literature that has come out in recent years about the different forms of urbanization that we are seeing. I want to make a few remarks very quickly before I invite comments and questions. I do see that there is already a question here in the chat box, and I invite others to please add your questions here in the chat box. And if you would like to speak, please raise your hand. There is an icon right here which you can use. I do want to point out, certainly for me, that the contribution here in the two presentations has been certainly in terms of the empirical content that will inform policy, but also in terms of the conceptual categories that we have been using. And particularly, this increasingly blurred line that we see between the rural and the urban. This has been theorized, I think, in a global context, in the Indian context as well. And this is one of the questions that I will in fact pose to Dr. Kennedy and to Dr. Mukhopadhyay. So that's the first, I think, a very interesting takeaway for me from these sets of presentations is to ask, how do we think about the categories? And even are the two, I think this is really where Dr. Mukhopadhyay ended to say, are rural and urban enough? Are those two categories really exhaustive, mutually exclusive, and do they actually capture the experience of land use transformation and economic transformation across, the spaces in India? The other aspect that I do want to talk about, and I will again pose this as a question to both Dr. Mukhopadhyay and Dr. Kennedy, is the question of methods. And as economists, I think we are trained in quantitative methods. Geospatial methods, for example, Dr. Kennedy, in the work that you presented, provide this very interesting macro perspective, which then comes into conversation with the micro insights that you get from the qualitative field work. And I think that, combining methods in that way is not only unusual, I think it's extremely insightful. And one of the questions that I had was also about, training economics students in, these variety of methods. So, Dr. Kennedy, if you could perhaps speak a little bit about, the process in the production of this particular paper, where you had, I think, a multidisciplinary team, right, working across a variety of geographies. And, is there perhaps a way for many of these, methodological engagements to occur within a smaller team of PhD program, right? For a scholar who perhaps wants to work on, understanding spaces and spatialities in cities or beyond cities as well, right? So over to you, Dr. Kennedy, with that.
Thank you very much, Ashima, Dr. Sood. Yes, these are very, very good remarks, and I'm happy to sort of engage with them and I think there's a lot to be said about this blurring of lines between rural and urban, and how we've really started thinking about these categories much more critically than in the past. And I want to flag, I think, the really important research that's been done, not only on subaltern urbanization, by Partha and other colleagues, but also agrarian urbanism. I'm thinking of Shubhra Gururani's work. This idea that this is not this linear kind of a trajectory from the rural to the urban, but it's more that these spaces are very much interconnected, and that so-called agrarian institutions very much shape what's going on in the urbanization process, and especially when we're talking about land politics, of course. And so I think we've learned a lot in recent years from that scholarship, and I think that it's really led us to really question those categories of urban and rural. And with regard to methods, yes, I agree that I think this is really a challenge for kind of graduate schools to really take on the challenge of interdisciplinary work, and I think collaborating with between departments would be a really good starting point. In our particular case, we had designed this research kind of protocol where we started out with what we called the spatial footprint, and we really looked at the spatial footprint over time. But that wasn't the end of the geospatial work. It's not like you just outsource that work and then you've got your maps and then you go to work. It really involves this iterative kind of a process where you look at the spatial data, and what can that raises a lot of questions, and that guides the research. And then the qualitative research then goes back to, say, more spatial kind of analysis, but at different different scales, kind of the area and the locality and that kind of thing. With the imagery now, I mean, there's resolution that's like 5 meters resolution, including among open access kind of sources. So I really think that this is something that economics departments need to look at very seriously, is some kind of skill base. Just like we're all going toward data sciences, well, we need to also add this kind of spatial geospatial dimension as well. I'll stop there to leave time for others. Thank you very much, Ashima.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kennedy. I do want to say a few things also when it comes to these new conceptualizations. I was very curious to hear from both of you about the notion of planetary urbanization, and of course we are thinking about as you correctly said the whole idea of agrarian urbanism. I see that Dr. Ankita Rathi was here, who has also written about these themes. And of course, Dr. Shubhra Gururani, who's probably the pioneer, talking about these things. Recombitant urbanization. Dr. Sai Balakrishnan. And my question was, to what extent do concepts that are derived from perhaps international experience, to what extent would they apply in the Indian context? And I'm thinking both from a policy perspective, but also because conceptualizations like gentrification, for example, or suburbanization have really they've proved very hard to apply to the Indian context. So perhaps I could invite Dr. Mukhopadhyay to speak to that first, given that he's really pioneered sort of our understanding of these small and medium towns through the idea of subaltern urbanization. And then I would love to hear from Dr. Kennedy as well.
Thank you, Ashima. I mean, small and medium towns used to be very fashionable in the 1970s. I recall Professor Mathur doing a large volume on that particular subject around that time. We sort of merely, I think, and this is, I think, an important question. disciplinary and from where the research is being conducted. And my sense is a lot of the urban research, both within urban economics and within the broader studies of urban studies per se, I think became concerned with cities. And that's because most of where that research was done, whether it is in Europe, the US, or even Latin America, the process of urbanization had achieved a certain maturity, whereas, and hence the process of transformation from something non-urban to urban, or that whole, along that continuum, was less of an empirical phenomena than it is in, let's say, Africa. And consequently, what we did in some sense through this supporting project was to try and refocus some of that light back to saying that, look, we need to think about not just about cities, we also need to think about urbanization, the process. And this is something which Loraine also sort of referred to earlier in her early remarks. And that is, I think, one of the core things that we've sort of, and now, as you said, with various kinds of theorization that are trying to grapple with the nature of this transformation, whether it's subaltern, recombinant, agrarian, they're all sort of, they all recognize there is a process that is taking place. And the question is how exactly to sort of capture it in a manner that sort of makes it visible to other researchers and enables people to sort of think through that particular area. So that's one part of the story that I think it's coming through. The second story that I think is important is to understand that within the urban economics story, there was also a strong focus on what we called agglomeration and the benefits of agglomeration. And therefore, automatically, the focus went to the larger cities, right? And so the work is, okay, most of the economic activity takes place within the top 10 cities, etc. Though if you actually look at the numbers, it's not fully clear how exactly that kind of structure is put in place. The issue with that is, even within our economic story, the causality is difficult. And more importantly, we don't really have a good theoretical sense of what is big enough. Right? So most of Europe is populated with cities that are way below 1 million. And they function perfectly effectively. They have a whole bunch of agglomeration benefits, structures. So even if I sort of stipulate that there are benefits from agglomeration, at what level do they actually kick in? They kick in at 100,000, 300,000, 500,000, 1 million, 10 million. Where exactly is that story? And I think there is a great deal of ambiguity and lack of data and detail that sort of are coming through in that species. And that's where the small medium town story and the other stuff becomes important, to try and understand the economics of these places, the role they are playing within the sort of continuum of urbanization. What exactly are they moving forward? In the last census, we saw a great deal of movement from urban to urban migration compared to the old rural to urban migration that came through, which then sort of asks you, are these smaller places destinations or way stations, which is sort of the kind of work that Brett Randolph and Mukta Nayak have been doing on trying to understand that kind of space. So there is, and therefore when you start thinking about the urban landscape as both a continuum and as a whole, the nature of the questions that you ask become much more process-oriented than place-oriented. And that's what I think is fundamentally the kind of meta shift that one is trying to sort of move the system towards in some sense. Right? One of the issues, for example, that I've not touched upon, which is central to a lot of urban economics, is urban finance. So what is, are people sort of, what are we trying to say about that? What do we know about it? But fundamentally, when you take a step back and look at what governance is, most of our urban local bodies are doing nothing else but collecting garbage. So in a sense, until and unless, which is the cart and which is the horse? What would I do by devolving a lot of funds to an urban local body if the only function the urban local body has is to collect garbage? At the same time, can I actually devolve issues of water supply, of handling fecal waste, of electricity, of transportation, of economic planning? The big difference between China and India at the scale at which economic planning occurs. Should I hand them over with no revenue handles whatsoever? I think we, as economists, are not grappling enough with these kinds of issues. And therefore, while we need to do the kind of work that we are doing, we also need to step back a little bit and try and understand what is these processing issues that are taking place. That's one of the issues that comes forward. And finally, in terms of pedagogy and structures, economists, in my experience, is an extremely imperial discipline. So as long as we have the tools and we see data, whether it is radiance lights, whether it is spatial built-up points, as long as we can apply our tools to those data, we will try and use those tools and move ahead and essentially open up, and which is what's exactly happening. I think there's a lot of economic research that's coming out that is using this kind of data and structuring these kinds of stories, using the kinds of technologies that we often use to try and address the kinds of questions that Loraine is asking. But the question then is, obviously, we do, in many of these cases, economists do a pretty good job of answering what is happening, but without the kind of rich ethnographic work that a lot of urbanists do, it's very difficult to answer the question as to why what is happening and the processes that are generating the what that you're actually seeing. And it's there, I think, that more conversations need to take place. Our NEP is asking for these conversations, but I don't think either our universities or our institutes are actually prepared for the kind of interdisciplinary structures that would lead to those kinds of conversations. Right? So that's one of the issues that I think is going to be something that we have to resolve going forward.
Over to you, Dr. Kennedy. I know you've put a very interesting paper reference here.
Yes, that was just to respond to. I wasn't sure that I would have time actually, and I guess Keshab can let us know. But yeah, I just thought this was a very thoughtful paper by Fulong Wu, really questioning, how to think about gentrification, these categories like suburbanization, gentrification that have come out of a particular scholarship, developed in a particular place and time, and how do we think about those in other contexts, and are they even relevant? And or do we need to reconceptualize? And I think something like this comes back to the discussion on, agrarian urbanism, where it's just you have to talk about these particular so-called agrarian social institutions if you want to understand what's happening and what these urban transformations are about. I very much agree with Partha's remarks about a kind of a shift toward, more process based kind of analyses, as opposed to saying, oh, I'm doing the study in an urban space or I'm doing the study in a rural space. It's more what's happening here, and that's what we're looking at, and that these categories of, and for the reasons that Partha also reminded us, I mean, how do you define urban and rural, and this varies, of course, from place to place. So thank you very much for those questions. I think I should stop there. Leave some time.
So thank you so much, Dr. Keshab Das. We do have just a few additional moments, and in that, what I would like to do is pull together two of the questions that have come out here and have been, posed here in the chat box, and add one question of my own. In the first question relates to census data from 2011, and of course there might be gaps, and I want to actually turn this over to Dr. Mukhopadhyay to answer this. There's also the question that has been posed by Mr. Surendra Meher about the kinds of gaps or the differentials that we see in different states, right? And to what extent is that an artifact of the data, right? Or are there in fact underlying processes that might explain it? And then I think related to these two questions, certainly for me, is the big elephant in the room, which is census 2021, and we do not yet have that data. That data remains elusive, and a lot of the work that has been done, it's been possible to have these insights because of data availability. And what other kinds of data might we be able to access and deploy to answer the questions that have been posed from previous censuses. I also see that Dr. R.B. Bhagat is here and he's raised his hand. He has a question.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Bhagat, if we may quickly just hear from Dr. Mukhopadhyay, and then I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashima. It was nice listening, Loraine, Partha, and you, and comments of Professor Das. So it's important that peripheral urbanization or peri-urbanization, but at the same time, what is happening in the dynamics within the city, and something I think some of the forces which are reshaping the core of the city, or what we call redevelopment. I see in Bombay a lot of investment going on within the city. For example, we have monorail, but monorail didn't take off, but a lot of investment gone into. Now, in Mumbai, we have very good suburban railway system, but metro is coming. So how investment capital is getting stuck, or it is amenable to reproduction of the capital. And so the core of the city is related with periphery. To some extent, there is some forces which is pushing from the core, and then the periphery getting certain growth. For example, farmhouse, or maybe certain other services. The second is that how periphery is related with the rural. So we have the whole dynamics of rural, peri-urban, and the core. So, and connected with the question of planning, I sometimes wonder whether there is a planning at all, or we have gone in project mode. So we see that master plan being prepared in cities, it takes several years, decades it takes in revising or in modifying the plan. So the present market driven situation, I wonder whether there is a planning. My last comment is that we are talking about about definition, rural, urban, what will be the urban, what will be the rural, and what is India's definition. I have been also working since very long time, and I wrote this rural urban classification and municipal governance, where I talked about census town in 2005, just after the 2001 census came out with this. So we look at, I think we have to reconceptualize urbanization process in a different way. Here we reconceptualize that urbanization is a finite process. So we are going to reach 100%. India's definition is stringent, okay. So we have 31%. In my estimates, we are never going to have 50% urbanization of India, even at the end of the 21st century. So, but that doesn't matter. 31 may be equal to 60. and then 50 will be equal to 90. So, but it gives a comparative understanding how India's different states and territories and regions are developing. That's the importance of the definition. Second is that let us look at urbanization, not a finite process, infinite process. And in that respect, for example, we have Kacha Road. Kacha Road makes Pakka Road, then it becomes 2 lane, then it becomes 4 lane, then it becomes expressway, highways, then expressway, and so many so. So what is this after all urbanization? Urbanization is basically, if you look at an infinite process, it is time-space restructuring. We are restructuring time and space, but that has very implication for human being. Who gets what and where? And the question of where is very important. Who gets what? Economists have been doing a lot, but then where people are getting. And in that respect, I like to connect with Partha's diagram, that where he has shown urban to rural ratio of the value added by the workers. And if you go, suppose you expand that graph and take mega city, metro city, and big city, and medium size and small, you will find the difference of 100, more than 100% or maybe 500%. So this is how agglomeration effect, space effect of capital agglomeration and all sorts of benefits are manifested through time space organization and in the capital accumulation. So that is very important. Question of urbanization is very important, how it is related to economic growth, how it is related to the inequality, wealth distribution, and also the right to the city. So I will end here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bhagat, for your intervention. I will, invite also Dr. Mukhopadhyay to perhaps speak about the data issues, particularly around census data. And I see that you also are replying here in the chat box, but if you could just take a few minutes, I think it would be most helpful to wrap up this discussion, especially because we have an audience of economists here. You're on mute.
Yeah, Loraine, would you like to take on anything before I go in?
No, please go ahead, Partha.
Thank you. So quickly, in terms of to respond to some of the questions that you're raising, on the questions that have come up in the chat with respect to the data on the specific district, my guess is there shouldn't really be any reason why that is not available. And what I'll do is, I don't think Lavinia is in the colloquium anymore, but if somebody could connect me or even to Kanu, would actually be a much more richer resource to be able to do that. I think we should be possible to get that structure across to him. So that's one quick response, and I'll just sort of, just for the sake of, I think I'll just put in my email here in case people want to get into technically. The second is with respect to the pace of urbanization, and that obviously there is a certain concavity in that curve, so that when you have lower levels of urbanization, you're moving faster. Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu are already sort of more than 50% urban, and therefore my guess is they would slow down. And consequently, I would guess that the what Dr. Meher is speaking about would be what I would expect to be the natural process moving forward, that you would and a catch-up story that is coming through. Now, on the catch-up story, there has been a fair degree of difference in terms of work that's sort of come out on Indian economics. But one of the more interesting pieces of work that seems to have come out, and I'll locate the reference and send it across to Dr. Keshab, is the fact that while there does seem to be lack of convergence or sufficient amount of convergence that you would expect within systems. When you measure it by looking at night lights, you actually see much more convergence than you see when you're looking at pure sort of district GDP kind of data. And I think, if I'm not wrong, that is work out of North Carolina, but I'll sort of double check on that and get back to Dr. Das on it. So that's a second kind of structure that is getting through, and it's possible, of course, as Dr. Bahar mentioned, that there are definitely different ways in which states sort of define urbanization, but the census story should take into account a fair degree of these kinds of structures, though. And it's something that we have not done. It might be an interesting thing to do, to see whether the average size of the spatial size, the geographic size of the ULB in these sort of low urbanization states is actually smaller than those in the higher urbanization states, in the sense that if the more urbanized states essentially have tended to expand their boundaries and therefore take into populations which may not fully meet the 75 criteria, but become urban because they're part of the statutory criteria. The political economy might work also because in the less urbanized states, the benefits from remaining rural may dominate the benefits from moving to urban, whereas in the more urbanized states, the opposite may actually be true. And there is some work, for example, Bhuvaneshwari's work on the periphery of Chennai, on the transformation of land and structures that it's moving through, and so all these stuff, etc. It sort of point to the way in which land transformation is taking place at my opinion. Difficult to respond to Professor Bhagat, since he has such a rich oeuvre of work. But let me quickly respond to 2 or 3 points, just to be provocative. On the size accumulation story, one of the more interesting things that we find is that when we look at wages, we find that while nominal wages actually are higher in the larger cities, real wages don't seem to be higher. Now, the people who do agglomeration work will argue that that work is done in nominal structures, and therefore productivity numbers are nominal stuff, and therefore you need to sort of we're looking at the wrong dimensions. But if you're talking about moving to the city from point of view of are the incentives for agglomeration well aligned, then the fact that you are not seeing a sufficiently strong real bump is hard for the migration process. And some of that is related to the fact that the urban labor market is at least at a minimal dual. So you essentially, when you go into the urban labor market, you have a certain probability of spending time in the informal labor market, where the wage premium is relatively small, and the formal labor market, where the wage premium is relatively high. The transition from the rural to the informal to the urban labor market happens with certain kinds of probabilities, and depending on how you are going to model this stuff, as to your expected wage may or may not sort of rise, and because the probabilities of obviously of transiting from the informal to the formal are dependent on your qualifications and training, and also, and this is something that again we haven't spoken about too much, is the fact that the opportunities are extremely variegated depending on which social class you come from, whether it's caste, whether it's class, and that sort of works through the social capital, that works through knowledge capitals, that works through active discrimination that a lot of them face in housing markets and employment markets. So there are many processes that are happening in the city that I think, I'm humbled as an economist when I spend time among my colleagues at the Center for Policy Research, because I get to see these kinds of conversations taking place. And and I realize how small a piece we actually focus on sometimes. Whereas we do have the tools to look at some of these pieces in a bit more a richer way. So these are kinds of structures that we sort of move through in that area. And also the other thing that you raised, Professor Bhagat, I think the issue of agglomeration being one, but the issue of investment in large cities is definitely another. And it is a very good question as to whether or not what is the cost benefit ratio, how do you deploy capital? Does it make more sense to build a metro in Mumbai, or does it make more sense to improve bus services in 100 cities of Maharashtra? And that is a good question. But improving bus services in 100, goes back to the standard Mansur-Olson small group, large group kind of stories. There is a small group which is strong and which is able to access the funds of the MMRDA, which is actually meant for the region and explicitly for a long time not used in the central city of Mumbai. And you sort of essentially, therefore, that small group is able to devote those investments into the central city of Mumbai and not sort of push it towards the 100 cities bus services. And that's an issue that we need to think about. So a political economy issue, and that we, again, an area where we spend less time than I think we should. And which has also got to do with the nature of planning. As you said, if you look at the Mumbai plan that has recently been released, you will not know after reading the plan that there is actually an Ahmedabad-Mumbai high-speed rail corridor being planned and actually under implementation, because that somehow doesn't seem to inform the land use plan at all. And it is this lack of conversation between infrastructure, economics, and land use that is within the planning space that I think is has led to some of the problems that we're currently facing right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukhopadhyay. Again, thank you, Dr. Kennedy, I think, for those very insightful presentations. I think the audience has learned a lot. I've learned a lot. And of course, thank you, Dr. Bhagat, for your intervention. I will hand it over now to Dr. Keshab Das and Dr. Amarendra.
Amarendra. Thank you so very much, Professor Mukhopadhyay, Professor Kennedy, Professor Ashima Sood, and also Professor Bhagat for very interesting questions, and others. I think there's so much to ask and to discuss, but then we have probably less time. And but this has actually provoked, and this has largely served the purpose of like informing the audience. And because this should be on the YouTube, it will also be helpful for future researchers, particularly younger ones, to maybe pay more attention to interdisciplinarity and also to microprocesses to inform larger policies. With that, I request Dr. Amarendra Das to please say a word of thanks. And,
yeah, I realize that this is an important topic, but I think there is very few discussion happening on these issues around. But maybe I'm not probably working in this field. That could be my ignorance also. But I think less discussion is happening. And thank you so much, Professor Loraine and Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay and Dr. Ashima for educating us. And I'm sure many people will watch this video and they'll pick up many research issues that you have raised. And so thank you very much. And again, thank you, Professor Keshab Das, for connecting with very good speakers. So with this, on behalf of Orissa Economics Association, I thank all the participants who could join and put questions. And thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Professor Bhagat. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
yeah.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ashima.